The evening air was cool and quiet as the judge drove through the familiar streets toward home. She had spent the day in the courthouse, moving from one courtroom to another, listening to people share stories, grievances, and confessions. Some days were emotionally heavy, but she had learned long ago to carry the weight lightly, keeping her focus sharp and her heart steady. Today had been one of those days where she felt a quiet pride in her work. She had listened carefully, asked questions, made fair decisions, and, for the most part, had left the courthouse feeling that she had done what was right. Her car hummed softly beneath her, a steady companion that had become part of her routine. She liked the solitude of her drive home. It gave her a chance to breathe, to process the day, and to think about small things outside of the courthouse, like what to cook for dinner, or whether she should finally start the book she had left on her nightstand. Tonight, she wasn't thinking about the work she had left behind so much as the peaceful quiet of the neighborhood. Streets she had driven countless times before. Then, out of nowhere, flashing blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, not out of fear but confusion. She was always careful to follow the law, and she knew her car and her license were all up to date. She slowed immediately, signaling, and pulled over to the side of the road. The lights reflected across her windshield, casting long, flickering patterns on the dashboard. The world seemed to slow down. She watched as a police officer stepped out of the patrol car. His movements were brisk, almost tense, and his eyes stayed fixed on her. She opened her window and greeted him politely, her voice calm, hiding the slight unease creeping into her chest. He didn't smile or nod. Instead, he asked for her license and registration in a tone that was sharp, almost accusatory. Confused, she reached for her wallet and handed them over. Hoping this was just a routine check, the officer studied the documents for a moment and looked back at her with an expression she could not read. His next words hit her like a sudden cold gust of wind. He said the car was reported stolen. She froze, her mind racing. This was impossible. This was her car. She had bought it, paid for it, insured it, and parked it in her own driveway every night. She tried to explain calmly, her voice steady, that the car belonged to her, that she had all the proper documentation. But he interrupted. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. She hesitated for a moment. She had been trained to follow orders, especially from law enforcement. At the same time, she felt the absurdity of the situation pressing down on her. She opened the door, stepped out, and kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. She looked at him directly, trying to show she was cooperative, not a threat. The street around them had started to draw attention. A few people slowed their cars, curious about what was happening, and some even parked a little further away to watch from a safe distance. The officer asked questions quickly, almost too quickly to keep up with, as if trying to catch her in a lie. "Where did you get this car? Who owns it? Have you ever been arrested?" She answered each question patiently, calmly explaining the details of her purchase and ownership. She gave her name, her work, and even mentioned her role in the courthouse. She explained that she had never been arrested and that the car was legally hers. Despite her calm tone and clear answers, he did not seem satisfied. He kept insisting the car was reported stolen. She could feel the tension rising, both inside herself and in the space between them. While she stood there, trying to maintain her composure, she noticed the small things around Hertha: rustling of leaves, the hum of passing cars, the faint sound of a dog barking in a nearby yard. She tried to hold on to those small, grounding details, reminding herself to stay calm. The officer's tone grew sharper and his posture rigid. He was calling something over the radio, and she realized he was asking for backup. Her heart sank a little. She could already feel the eyes of people nearby, watching silently, waiting for something to happen. She kept her hands in view and spoke with a steady voice. "Officer, I understand you are doing your job, but I assure you, this is my car. I have all the documentation. You can check the registration. It matches my identification." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he continued talking into his radio, the words too quiet for her to hear. A cold breeze blew, making the papers in her hands flutter slightly. She held them carefully, not wanting to drop anything, while keeping her gaze fixed on him. There was a strange mix of disbelief and frustration inside her. She had encountered difficult situations before, but this was different. She had been trained to be patient and fair, but never had she expected to be confronted like this over something so clearly hers. Minutes felt like hours. Each time she tried to speak, the officer either cut her off or waved his hand dismissively. She could see the impatience building in him, the way his jaw tightened and his eyes darted around as if he expected someone else to intervene. She reminded herself to stay calm, to breathe, and to stay respectful. She had learned that composure was often the best defense in situations that could escalate. Cars continued to slow down, as curious drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. A few drivers pulled out their phones, recording the incident from inside their vehicles. The judge felt a surge of anxiety, knowing that whatever happened next would be caught on camera. She also knew that she had to remain calm even if the situation seemed unfair. She straightened her shoulders, keeping her voice soft but firm. "Officer, I am asking you to verify the registration properly. You will see this car belongs to me." The officer glanced at her briefly, then back at his radio. She noticed the way he hesitated, the way he seemed unsure, as though he expected something else to confirm his suspicion. The thought crossed her mind that maybe this was not personal, that perhaps he was just following protocol. Still, the feeling of being doubted, of being treated as if she were a criminal when she was a respected member of the judicial system, stung deeply. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that anger would not help. She had faced more challenging moments in courtrooms filled with tension and conflict. She had learned to listen carefully, to hold her ground without aggression, and to speak clearly. Now, on the street, she applied the same lessons. She handed over the registration and her ID again, making sure everything was visible, and waited. The officer's hand hovered over his radio, still tense. He asked her a few more questions about the car, repeating some of what she had already said. She answered each time, her voice calm and measured. She could feel the curiosity of the onlookers pressing in. Some whispered to each other. Some shook their heads. She felt the weight of every eye on her. But she refused to show panic or frustration. Inside, she felt a quiet determination. She would not let this moment define her, nor would she let the situation escalate. She reminded herself that clarity and patience were her allies. She thought about how many people in her court had reacted under pressure, and how composure had often turned tense situations into manageable ones. She repeated silently to herself, "Stay calm, stay clear, stay steady," as the officer continued to speak into his radio. She noticed the sun setting, casting long shadows on the street. The fading light mirrored the growing tension, and she wondered how long it would take for someone to recognize the mistake. She felt a mix of frustration and hope. Frustration because she was being accused without reason, hope because she knew she had nothing to hide. Her documents were in order, and the truth was on her side. She remained standing beside the car, holding the papers carefully, waiting for confirmation, waiting for justice to catch up. The world seemed to hold its breath along with her. The quiet hum of the evening interrupted only by distant traffic and the occasional murmur of bystanders. She reminded herself that she could not control the assumptions of others, only her own actions and responses. And she chose to respond with dignity, patience, and clarity, hoping that would be enough to see the situation through. Minutes passed, the officer still tense, still insisting that something was wrong. She felt a quiet resolve building inside her. She would not be intimidated. She would not raise her voice. She would not allow fear or anger to dictate her actions. She was a judge. She had spent her life seeking truth and fairness. Now, in the middle of a street under flashing lights, she would stand by that principle, even as the situation dragged on. She kept her focus steady, knowing that the right outcome depended not on how loud she spoke, but on how calmly she held herself. She kept her hands visible, her papers in order, and her voice gentle but firm. Every word, every gesture was measured. She understood that patience and composure were her strongest allies. And so she waited, standing beside her car, under the flashing lights, facing an officer who did not yet see the truth. The evening air was cool against her skin, the shadows of the streets stretching long and quiet, She took another deep breath, steadying herself, ready to face whatever would come next. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling heavier than the last. The judge stood beside her car, papers in hand, trying not to let the rising tension show on her face. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, sharp and unrelenting, like he was trying to see through her. Every question he asked seemed designed to catch her off guard, but she answered carefully, choosing her words with patience. She reminded herself that reacting angrily would only make the situation worse. She had faced difficult moments in courtrooms full of anger, disbelief and confrontation, and she knew the power of calmness. "Where did you get this car?" The officer asked again, his voice tight with suspicion. "I bought it from a dealership. I have the registration and the receipt if you need to see it," she said, keeping her tone steady. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the car, scanning the license plate as if it might suddenly change. She could sense his frustration building. It was almost tangible, hanging in the cool evening air. Cars continued to pass by slowly, some drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. A few parked further down the street out of curiosity, their phones raised, recording silently. She knew she was being watched, and a small part of her wished she could disappear, but she refused to let that show. She had faced judgment before, and she could face it again. Even under these flashing lights, the officer took a step closer, his presence imposing. "Do you have any identification besides this?" he asked, pointing to her driver's license. She shook her head slightly, her hands steady. "This is my identification. My name is on the registration and matches my driver's license. Everything is in order." He looked at her skeptically, then back at his radio. She realized he was calling someone else, repeating the story she had already told. She noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he spoke, a sign that even he was beginning to feel the tension. The crowd of onlookers seemed to sense it too, standing quietly at a distance, some whispering to each other, but none daring to interfere. The judge took a slow breath, steadying herself. She thought about how easy it would be for someone in her position to lose control. She could feel the frustration bubbling inside her, but she held it in. She reminded herself of the countless people she had faced in court who had been unfairly accused, who had felt powerless in the face of authority. She had always told herself to act with fairness and composure. She would do the same now. The officer's voice grew firmer. "Have you ever been arrested before?" "No," she replied, her tone calm. "I have never been arrested. I work at the courthouse. You can check my records if necessary." His eyes narrowed, and he seemed to hesitate. For a moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the faint hum of passing cars and the rustling of leaves in the wind. She could feel the pressure mounting, but she stayed still, keeping her hands visible and her voice controlled. Then she noticed movement at the corner of her eye. Another officer had arrived, walking briskly toward them. He was older, his posture calm, but authoritative. He carried himself differently, as if he had seen situations like this many times before. The younger officer looked at him briefly, then back at her, as if trying to assert control. But the older officer's presence seemed to change the atmosphere slightly. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his voice calm and steady, "may I see your documents?" She handed him the registration and her identification again, even though she had already shown them. He took his time looking over the papers, reading carefully, without judgment or accusation. She could feel a sense of relief slowly starting to build inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this situation would be understood before it escalated further. The younger officer, however, was not finished. He continued, insisting that something was wrong, that the car was flagged as stolen. She could feel his impatience growing, his voice rising slightly, but she did not respond with anger. She simply repeated calmly, "Everything is correct. The car is registered in my name. I have all the documentation to prove it." The older officer nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the truth she was stating. He asked a few quiet questions, confirming details without accusation. She answered each one, her voice soft but firm. The younger officer seemed uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot, looking at his partner as if seeking validation. She realized that the presence of the second officer was preventing the situation from getting worse. and she silently thanked him for it. The older officer stepped aside slightly and spoke quietly into his radio. The younger officer continued talking, but there was a subtle change in his tone, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. She noticed the way he glanced at her, the fleeting look of doubt crossing his face. For the first time, it seemed like he was questioning his own assumptions. She remained calm, even as her mind raced. She thought about how quickly things could have turned ugly if she had reacted differently. If the younger officer had become more aggressive, if she had shown fear. She understood the fragility of the moment and held herself steady, knowing that patience and clarity were her best allies. A few cars passed by slowly. Some drivers taking photos or recording video, but no one approached. She kept her focus on the officers, speaking when necessary, never raising her voice, never letting frustration show. She repeated again that the car belonged to her, that she had all the proper documents, and that the registration matched her identification. The older officer finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Let's make sure we check the registration thoroughly," he said. He took her papers and began typing into his device, running the information carefully. She watched quietly, hands folded calmly in front of her, trying not to fidget as she waited. She noticed the younger officer shifting uncomfortably beside her, his earlier confidence waning under the quiet authority of his partner. She could feel the tension in the air, easing slightly as the older officer worked, his movements methodical, without accusation or aggression. She thought about how important it was for authority to be paired with understanding, for assumptions to be checked against facts. She reminded herself that this was not personal. Even though it felt unfair, the younger officer muttered something under his breath. She could see the frustration building again. He clearly wanted to be right, to prove that she was lying or mistaken. But the older officer's calm presence held the situation steady. She realized that in moments like this, character mattered as much as facts. She stayed composed, aware that any sudden movement or raised voice could change the course of events. Minutes passed slowly. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that a second officer had arrived, frustration at being doubted, and a quiet determination to see the situation through with dignity. She thought about all the people who had been accused unfairly in her courtroom, about the lessons she had learned from listening, observing, and understanding. She reminded herself that calmness and clarity could often resolve conflicts more effectively than confrontation. She took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. She glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered, sensing the curiosity and quiet judgment from some, the silent support from others. She stood tall, holding her papers carefully, speaking softly but firmly when necessary. She repeated once more that the car was legally hers. She had all the proper documentation, that she had nothing to hide. The older officer finally nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly. There was a subtle shift in the air, a sense that the truth was beginning to emerge. The younger officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed, as the older officer continued his careful verification. She could feel the tension easing, the invisible pressure that had weighed on her since the first officer approached beginning to lift slightly as she waited. She reflected on the power of composure and patience. She thought about how easily the situation could have escalated, how quickly assumptions could lead to conflict. She felt a quiet gratitude for the older officer's calm presence and professionalism. She knew that her ability to remain steady had helped prevent the situation from becoming worse. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street. The evening was quiet, except for the occasional hum of passing cars and the faint rustle of leaves. She stood beside her car, holding her papers, her mind calm but alert. She repeated silently to herself, "Stay steady, stay clear, stay patient." She knew the resolution was near, but she would not relax until she was certain everything was understood correctly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the older officer spoke again. "We're going to verify this fully. Please remain patient for a few more minutes." She nodded, keeping her hands visible, her voice calm. She understood that the truth would come out, that facts would prevail over assumptions, and that her composure had played a key role in preventing escalation. She stood quietly, feeling the cool evening breeze, aware of the eyes around her, and determined to see this through with dignity and calmness. Even as she waited, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She had handled herself with patience, clarity, and respect. She had not let fear or frustration dictate her actions. She had remained composed under pressure even when unfairly accused. And she knew deep down that her integrity and calmness would carry her through whatever came next. The younger officer continued to fidget, but she paid him little attention, focusing instead on the older officer and the verification process. She remained composed, alert, and patient, knowing that the situation would be resolved if facts were allowed to speak for themselves. And so she waited. Standing beside her car, papers in hand under the flashing lights, as the older officer worked carefully, verifying every detail, while the younger officer watched, tension still evident but slowly giving way to doubt. The evening air was quiet, the shadows long, and she felt a calm determination settle within her. Ready for whatever outcome awaited, the older officer continued to type into his device, his fingers moving deliberately over the keys, double-checking every detail. The judge stood nearby, her posture calm and composed, hands folded gently over the registration papers. The younger officer hovered, his impatience growing, as he glanced from the judge to his partner. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet tension, as if everyone present sensed that the truth was about to surface. The older officer finally looked up and met her eyes. There was a soft nod, almost imperceptible, but it gave her a small sense of reassurance. He was no longer just another authority figure demanding answers. He was someone willing to see the facts clearly without bias or assumption. She felt a tiny spark of hope that this ordeal might be over soon, though she knew better than to relax entirely. Moments like this could change in an instant if patience and care were not maintained. "Ma'am," the older officer said quietly, his voice calm and steady, "can you tell me again where you purchased this car?" She repeated once more the details of her purchase. She mentioned the dealership, the date, and that she had kept all the records. She added calmly that the registration was up to date and that the insurance was active. Each word was measured, steady, and clear, leaving no room for doubt. She could feel the eyes of the younger officer on her, flicking between her and the older officer. His earlier confidence waning, the older officer continued typing, pausing occasionally to review the information on his screen. He looked thoughtful, careful, not rushing to judgment. The judge noticed that his presence seemed to calm not only the situation but even the younger officer slightly. As if his authority brought a sense of balance to the moment, she allowed herself a small breath, steadying her nerves while remaining alert. The younger officer, clearly frustrated, stepped closer and leaned slightly over the hood of her car. "Are you sure this is your car?" he asked again, as if repeating the question enough times would somehow change the answer. "Yes," she said firmly, keeping her tone soft but unwavering. "This car belongs to me. The registration matches my name, and all the documentation is in order. I have nothing to hide." Her words hung in the air, calm but resolute. The younger officer frowned, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced at the older officer. He could sense that the older officer was not simply accepting his assumptions without verification. And for the first time, the younger officer seemed unsure. He muttered something quietly to himself, as if reconsidering everything he had assumed up to that point. The older officer finally spoke again, addressing both of them. "We need to confirm the registration thoroughly. Let's take a moment and ensure everything matches." He gestured politely to the younger officer, and there was a pause as both officers worked quietly. The judge stood beside them, her hands resting calmly on the roof of her car, watching patiently as the verification continued. She felt a mix of relief and anticipation. Knowing that each moment brought her closer to clarity, she noticed a few onlookers lingering at a distance. Some were whispering to each other, their phones held up, recording silently. Others simply watched, curious, yet careful not to interfere. She felt a quiet awareness of their presence, but she refused to let it affect her. She focused instead on the facts, on the calm authority of the older officer, and on her own measured responses. The older officer typed steadily, his eyes scanning the screen as he reviewed the registration. He looked up briefly and asked, "Ma'am, Can you confirm the VIN number for me? She did so without hesitation, reciting the number clearly. The older officer nodded, typing it in carefully, verifying each digit. He glanced at her once more as if acknowledging her patience and composure through this ordeal. She returned his gaze steadily, showing neither anger nor fear, only calm assurance. The younger officer fidgeted, clearly frustrated by the slow, methodical process. He wanted an immediate resolution, preferably one that confirmed his assumptions. But the facts were not bending to his expectations. He muttered under his breath again, and she could see his annoyance growing, though he made no move to escalate further. The older officer's steady presence seemed to hold him in check. The older officer leaned back slightly, tapping a few keys, and then spoke in a quiet voice. The registration shows this car is indeed in your name, and there is no report of theft. The judge's heart lifted slightly, though she kept her expression calm. She nodded politely. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate you verifying that." The younger officer blinked, clearly taken aback. He looked from the judge to his partner, then back at the screen, his earlier certainty shaken. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but the older officer held up a hand, signaling patience. "Let's make sure everything is clear before taking any further steps," he said. The judge took a small, steadying breath. She felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Relief that the facts were finally aligning with the truth. Tension because the younger officer still seemed uncertain, still clinging to his initial assumptions. She reminded herself again that her calmness, her patience, and her willingness to answer every question clearly had been key in preventing this. From escalating further, the younger officer muttered something under his breath, pacing slightly. She noticed his hands trembling just a little, a sign that he was realizing the seriousness of his error. She did not gloat, did not show triumph. She simply stood patiently, composed, and observant. Understanding that the situation had reached a critical turning point, the older officer continued verifying details, making notes carefully, checking everything twice. He glanced at the younger officer, who now seemed to be reconsidering his approach entirely. She could sense the younger officer's internal struggle. Between the desire to assert authority and the undeniable facts that were contradicting his assumptions, she stayed silent, allowing the process to unfold naturally, trusting that truth would prevail. Finally, the older officer looked up at her, his expression calm and respectful. "Everything checks out," he said quietly. "The car belongs to you. There is no record of theft, and your registration is correct." She felt a wave of relief wash over her, though her voice remained calm. "Thank you," she said again, quietly acknowledging the diligence of the older officer. She could feel the tension easing, though the younger officer still seemed reluctant to accept the reality. The younger officer fidgeted, shifting from one foot to the other, his earlier bravado fading. He glanced at the judge, then at his partner, finally seeming to recognize the mistake he had made. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the distant hum of passing cars and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The older officer addressed both of them. "Let's make sure the report reflects this accurately. Mistakes can happen, but we need to record the correct information." The judge nodded, keeping her tone calm and measured. "Of course," she said. "Accuracy is important." She held her papers carefully, her posture steady, showing that she remained composed despite the ordeal. The younger officer looked uneasy, finally lowering his eyes and muttering something inaudible. The older officer continued working quietly, his calm approach preventing further confrontation. She remained patient, allowing the verification to be completed without interruption. Understanding that patience had been the key to managing this situation, she thought about how easily things could have gone differently. If she had reacted with anger or fear, if the older officer had not intervened, if the younger officer had become more aggressive, this encounter could have escalated into something far more serious. She reflected on her own composure and the importance of responding with patience and clarity, even under unfair circumstances. As the older officer finished his checks, he looked at her once more. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said quietly. "We need to make sure these things are correct, but I see that everything is in order now." She nodded politely. "Thank you," she replied. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength in it. She understood the importance of maintaining dignity and composure even when faced with unnecessary suspicion. The younger officer, still fidgeting slightly, finally stepped back, his shoulders slumping just a little. It was clear that he was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation and the error in his assumptions. She did not say anything to him, choosing instead to focus on the facts and the calm resolution brought by the older officer. The older officer continued to make notes, ensuring that the report was accurate. The judge stood quietly beside her car, aware of the small crowd that had gathered, but paying them little attention. She focused on the reality of the moment. The facts had been verified, the misunderstanding had been clarified, and the situation was under control. She thought about the lessons embedded in this experience, the importance of patience, clarity, and calmness, the need to respond to assumptions with truth rather than anger, and the value of professional presence in diffusing tension. She felt a quiet sense of resolve, knowing that these lessons would stay with her long after the lights of the patrol car had gone. Finally, as the older officer finished the verification, he looked at her and said, "You're free to go." "Thank you for your patience," she nodded, keeping her expression calm and composed. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady. She collected her papers carefully, keeping everything in order, and prepared to leave, knowing that her composure had helped prevent a small misunderstanding from becoming a much larger conflict. The younger officer watched quietly, still uneasy, but no longer confrontational. She stepped into her car, started the engine, and drove slowly away, keeping a careful eye on the road. The flashing lights faded behind her, leaving only the quiet hum of her car in the cool evening air. She took a deep breath, reflecting on the experience, the tension, and the resolution, and felt a quiet sense of pride in the way she had handled herself, even as she drove away. She knew the lessons of this encounter would linger reminders of the importance of patience, dignity, and composure, and of the quiet strength required to face misunderstanding without losing oneself. The evening air was cool and calm now, and she felt a sense of balance returning, carrying her home safely from an experience that had tested her in unexpected ways. After the verification was completed, the judge remained standing beside her car for a moment, letting herself absorb what had just happened. The older officer had confirmed that her car was legally hers and that there was no report of theft. A wave of relief ran through her, though it was mixed with lingering tension. The younger officer still stood nearby, his body stiff, eyes darting between her and his partner, as if he was trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself that staying composed had been the key to navigating the situation. She had remained calm, polite, and patient, even when the accusation felt absurd and unfair. She could feel the difference that presence and composure had made. The older officer had seen the facts clearly, had approached the situation with respect, and had helped prevent it from escalating. Without him, the encounter could have ended very differently. The older officer glanced at her, its expression calm but serious. "Everything checks out. You are free to go," he said. Then, in a softer tone, he added, "I apologize for the inconvenience. Mistakes like this happen, but I understand this was frustrating." She nodded, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to verify everything properly," she said. Her words were quiet but firm, expressing gratitude while also maintaining her dignity. The younger officer shifted awkwardly, clearly struggling with the realization that he had been wrong. His earlier certainty had evaporated, replaced by discomfort. She noticed how tense his shoulders were, how his hands fidgeted at his sides. He seemed unsure of what to say, and she chose not to speak to him directly. She understood that acknowledgement would have to come from reflection rather than confrontation. The older officer gave the younger one a look that spoke volumes, a silent reminder that assumptions without verification could lead to serious consequences. The younger officer muttered something under his breath, lowering his eyes, and finally seemed to accept the reality of the situation. The judge collected her documents carefully, making sure everything was in order before closing her car door. She remained calm, her posture steady, her expression composed. She knew that any hint of anger or frustration could give the impression of confrontation, and she did not want to add to the tension unnecessarily. She had handled the situation with patience, and now it was time to conclude it gracefully. She glanced around at the few bystanders who had lingered, their phones still recording from a distance. Some looked sympathetic, others merely curious. She ignored them, focusing instead on the reality of what had just happened. She reflected on the importance of remaining calm, the power of patience, and the value of speaking clearly and truthfully under pressure. The entire situation had been uncomfortable, even humiliating at times, but she had maintained her composure and her dignity throughout. The younger officer finally stepped back, giving her space. His earlier intensity had faded, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of the mistake. He seemed to understand, at least in that moment, that assumptions could be harmful and that professionalism mattered more than proving oneself right. She did not say anything to him directly. She understood that lessons were often learned silently. Through reflection, rather than confrontation, the older officer continued to speak quietly, giving instructions to ensure the incident report reflected the correct information. He typed carefully, making sure every detail was accurate, every fact verified. The judge watched quietly, standing beside her car, aware that this step was important. Documentation mattered. She appreciated the care with which he approached it. As the minutes passed, she felt the tension in her body slowly easing. The flashing lights of the patrol car still reflected off nearby buildings, but they no longer felt threatening. They were simply part of the moment, a reminder of what had happened, but no longer a source of fear or stress. She straightened her shoulders, adjusting her coat, and took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel the quiet relief of resolution. The older officer finally looked up and met her eyes. "Everything is now documented correctly," he said. "You are free to continue your evening. I again apologize for the inconvenience and for any stress this caused." She nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you. I understand that mistakes happen. I appreciate your professionalism and your attention to accuracy," she said. She wanted to acknowledge the older officer's role in handling the situation with care and respect. His calm approach had prevented escalation and had allowed the truth to be recognized without conflict. The younger officer remained quiet, his earlier defensiveness replaced by a tentative acceptance. She noticed the slight slump in his posture, the way he avoided direct eye contact, and she recognized that he was processing what had occurred. She understood that sometimes lessons were learned slowly, that humility often came after realization rather than immediately. She opened the car door and slipped inside, closing it carefully. She adjusted her seatbelt, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. The engine started smoothly, and she kept her hands steady on the wheel. She glanced briefly at the patrol car, noting the older officer's calm expression and the younger officer's uneasy stance. She did not speak, did not gesture. She simply acknowledged the resolution internally, appreciating the way the older officer had handled the situation and reflecting on her own role in maintaining composure as she drove away slowly. The tension of the moment gradually lifted. She could feel the difference between fear and confidence, between frustration and composure. She reflected on the lessons embedded in the encounter. Patience and clarity had been her greatest allies. Her willingness to answer every question calmly, without anger or defensiveness, had helped prevent escalation. And the presence of a professional, measured officer had allowed the truth to surface without confrontation. She thought about how easily the situation could have gone differently. One wrong word, one impatient gesture, could have turned a misunderstanding into a serious conflict. She considered the power of assumptions and how quickly they could distort reality. She recognized the importance of professionalism, both in law enforcement and in everyday life. And she silently hoped that this incident would serve as a reminder to others about the value of patience, verification, and calm authority. The streetlights reflected off the windshield, casting soft patterns across the dashboard. She felt the quiet rhythm of the engine beneath her, a comforting presence after the tension of the past hour. She thought about the people who had been watching from a distance, and she hoped that her calm, composed behavior had conveyed the importance of dignity and patience even in difficult moments. She glanced at her registration papers once more, ensuring everything was safely tucked away. She reflected on the difference between being accused unfairly and responding with composure. It was not easy to remain calm when faced with doubt, suspicion, or false accusation, but she had done so. She had maintained her dignity, her calm, and her clarity, and in doing so she had prevented the situation from escalating, had allowed the truth to emerge, and had demonstrated the quiet strength that comes from composure and patience as she continued driving. She thought about how the younger officer might reflect on his actions. Perhaps he would recognize the importance of verifying assumptions, the value of listening carefully, and the need to approach every situation with professionalism and respect. She did not dwell on anger or frustration toward him. She understood that growth often comes from reflection and that everyone makes mistakes. The older officer had handled the situation with care, and she silently acknowledged his professionalism. His calm, measured approach had been instrumental in ensuring that the encounter concluded safely and fairly. She thought about how important it was to have people in positions of authority who acted with integrity, who valued truth over assumptions, and who prioritized careful verification over immediate judgment. She drove through familiar streets, the evening calm now settling around her. The tension of the encounter began to fade, replaced by a quiet reflection on what had just happened. She thought about the lessons she could carry forward, the importance of patience, clarity, and calmness, the power of composure under pressure, and the quiet strength of dignity in the face of misunderstanding. She knew that this experience would stay with her, not as a source of anger or frustration, but as a reminder of how integrity, composure, and patience could navigate even the most challenging situations. She continued her drive home, the city lights passing softly around her, her thoughts clear, her heart steady, and her resolve intact. When she finally turned onto her street, she felt a sense of closure. The encounter had tested her patience and composure, but she had met it with dignity. She parked her car in her driveway, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The cool evening air felt refreshing now, free from the earlier tension. She closed her eyes for a moment, appreciating the quiet, and then walked toward her front door, carrying with her the lessons of calmness, patience, and measured response. Even as she entered her home, she reflected on the experience, thinking about how easy it is to make assumptions about others, how quickly situations can escalate, and how valuable composure and professionalism are in preventing conflict. She knew the story of this evening would stay with her, a reminder of the importance of dignity, clarity, and patience in every interaction, and the quiet power of standing firm in truth.